Today's session will focus on how to read an IEP. The outcomes for today's session are to read and understand the different parts of an IEP, determine the supports the student needs based on their IEP, some components of the IEP are the student and school information, eligibility, participation planning, present levels of academic and functional performance, special considerations, accommodations, extended school year, transition, goals, services, and least restrictive environment. The first section is the student and school information page. On this page you will see the IEP team meeting date, the parent information, the next annual meeting date, and assessment dates, the student's primary disability, and areas affected by the disability. The next section is eligibility. The example shown is initial evaluation eligibility. You can see areas impacted by the suspected disability, the discussion to support the reasoning for requesting additional assessments, the date that the parent consented for the evaluation to occur, the date of the initial evaluation, if the student is eligible for special education services, and the reasoning for why the student qualifies for special education services. The next eligibility page will indicate the primary disability, the date of the IEP development, the date parent consented for services to begin, and the date that the IEP is in effect. The date the IEP goes into effect is the date that services, accommodations, data collections, everything begins. Participation planning is the next section. This goes over the student participation on district, statewide assessments, and graduation information. Here you can see if the student is an English language learner, if the student will participate in statewide assessments, what the previous statewide assessment scores were for the student. You can also see if the student is being assessed and instructed using an alternate curriculum and alternate standards. The next section is the present levels of academic and functional performance. In the Areas Assessed section, you may see assessment data related to reading, writing, math, cognition, social emotional or self-management, fine and gross motor, and speech and language. There are additional areas that students can be assessed in. If you have any questions about the assessment data, please contact your case manager for additional information related to the student or students that you are working with. This is what the Areas Assessed section looks like on the IEP. You can see what is the area that was being assessed. So in the example provided is reading fluency. You can see what sources of information were used to collect that data. You can see what the student's current level of performance is, what the assessment results were, and if this area impacts the student's performance. The assessment data reflected in the present levels is an example of why work samples and classroom assessment data is so important. Ensuring that you provide the supports outlined on the IEP, but not over-supporting, allows the case manager to determine where the student is currently performing, What supports are helping the student make progress and be successful? And what additional supports the students may need to be successful? The next section of the present levels of academic and functional performance is the area discussion. The first question is looking at what is the parent's input to the student's educational program? What are the student's strengths, other interest areas, significant personal attributes, and personal accomplishments? What are some things that the student likes to do outside of school and that they do really well in? Then how does the student's disability affect his or her involvement in the general education curriculum? How does this impact their access in the classroom? The next section is special considerations. Students may have additional needs that need to be addressed within the special consideration section. Communication needs, assistive technology needs, a behavior intervention plan, or functional behavior assessments. If they are English learners, they're blind or visually impaired, or if they are deaf or hard of hearing. If you have any questions about the specific special considerations listed within the IEP, contact your case manager for further information. The next section is accommodations. You can see the name of the accommodation, why the student needs access to this accommodation, and where the accommodation can be used. Some accommodations can only be used within instruction. Other accommodations can be used on statewide assessments. You need to be sure to access this section of the IEP to ensure that you are providing accommodations when and where they are appropriate. The next section is looking at supplementary aids. You can see what the support is needed. In this particular example, is access to speech to text. How often the student requires this support. This student needs access to speech to text daily. You can see who provides this support. And then you can see a reason why the student needs this support and how it should look in the classroom. Many of your students will have a list of supplementary aids. Be sure to review them and that you know how they should be used in the classroom. If you are unsure and you need a model, please reach out to your case manager. The next section is extended school year. Annually, at an IEP meeting, it must be determined if a student qualifies for extended school year. Students can qualify based on a presence of critical life skills or regression in the area of critical life skills. This section will outline if the student does qualify for extended school year. The next section is transition. This is typically filled out when students are 14 years and older. If you are working with an elementary age student or a student younger than 14 years of age, this section will be blank in their IEP. If you are working with a student who does have a transition plan, this outlines the student preferences and interests relating to transitioning to a career or a college, the assessment results, and any post-secondary goals that the student has. The next section of the transition section discusses activities that will support the student to achieving their post-secondary goals, and then additional agencies that can support the student with their post-secondary goals. The next section of the IEP is the goals. You can see the area of the goal, So this particular example is written language mechanics. This aligns with the areas assessed. So if there are deficits outlined in the areas assessed, they can be addressed here. The goal is for the annual cycle of the IEP. The evaluation method tells how data will be collected, and then with what accuracy that the student needs to demonstrate to prove mastery of the goal. Then there are objectives. The objectives are stepping stones to get the student to achieve the annual goal. Objectives can be broken down by skill, or can be broken down by percentage levels to support the student to getting to the end goal of the annual goal. If you have any questions about a goal that you should be measuring, please contact your case manager. The next section is services. This section will tell you what the service is, where the service will be taking place. So is it inside the general education classroom or is it outside the general education classroom? How much time is allotted to the service? So the first example has 5 sessions that are 40 minutes in length that happen weekly. So this student has 5 40-minute sessions a week. It shares the beginning and end date of the service, who are the providers of the service, and the service summary. If the service is to be occurring outside of the general education setting, that service cannot be provided within the general education setting. If you are assisting in providing a service, your position title is to be listed within the provider section. The next section is looking at least restrictive environment. This section will share what placements were considered. We'll also share how often the student is in the general education classroom. Our goal is that students are supported in general education classrooms. Sometimes you may see general education teachers or other service providers supporting within the general education classroom. You may see students being pulled out of their regular classes to meet with their service provider. You may see some self-contained classrooms where students are taught by special education teachers with other special education students outside of the general education classroom. So these are a lot of our specialized programs. You will not work with separate schools or residential schools inside Frederick County Public Schools. The last section of the IEP is the authorizations page. Parents only need to provide their signed consent when an initial IEP is first being developed and services are first being put into place. Every IEP afterwards does not require a signature. Take the time to sit down with your case manager and the classroom teachers to discuss the student or students' needs that you will be working with. Collaboration is the key to success. After today's learning module, you should be able to read a student's IEP, find the accommodations, supplementary aids, supports, and services that a student requires to access the curriculum and to make progress on their IEP goals. If you have additional questions, you can review the module or contact the case manager or case managers that you work with.